December 21st, 1975. A quiet day in Vienna, shattered as 6 gunmen storm an OPEC meeting. In minutes, they take over 60 hostages from the world's most powerful oil countries. What follows is a chaotic 24-hour siege packed with murder, a bloody shootout, a police force comically out of its depth, culminating in a wild escape via private jet. This is the insane but true story of the OPEC siege. On the morning of the 21st, around 11:30 a.m., the operation kicks off with a tram ticket. 6 heavily armed figures enter a Vienna tram on their way to OPEC headquarters for just a handful of shillings. At 11:45, they enter the building. This was their crew. 2 hardline PFLP fighters, Lebanese militant Anis Nakach, a pair of German left-wing radicals, and their leader, the man who would go on to be one of the most wanted international terrorists, Carlos the Jackal.
Fast forward to today, 2026. We are here to dissect what many call the first major terrorist attack in post-war Austria. And while that title isn't technically true, the OPEC siege was undoubtedly the one that changed everything.
We will walk you through this insane crisis step by step. But first, we need to answer 2 critical questions. Who were these attackers, and why did they target OPEC? Let's break down the target. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Think of it as the most powerful oil cartel on Earth. Founded in 1960, its mission is brutally simple: to control the global oil market and pump up profits for its members. And in 1975, 5 of its 12 key players were Middle Eastern powerhouses. This made their Vienna headquarters the perfect place for a storm to hit that had been brewing for a while now. We'll have to rewind to 1973 and the Yom Kippur War. A coalition led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, aiming to recapture the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, both of which had previously been, according to the International Court of Justice, illegally occupied by Israel since the Six-Day War in 1967. The massive US military aid that flooded in to support Israel triggered a seismic response throughout the Arab world. In retaliation, Arab members of OPEC slammed the taps shut, imposing a crushing oil embargo on America and its allies. Overnight, oil prices skyrocketed. The resulting shockwaves, hyperinflation, unemployment, panic rippled across the globe. This is what is now known as the 1973 oil crisis. OPEC's embargo proved its power, but it also exposed a divide within the cartel. Inside the organization, a visible split between the Arab nations emerged. On one side, you had the radicals, like Libya's Gaddafi, who wanted to keep prices sky high to financially pressure countries supporting Israel's occupation. On the other, the so-called moderates, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, who wanted stable, predictable prices to fuel their own long-term economies. Carlos and his team weren't there to voice their disagreement. They were sent on a targeted mission, not just to take hostages, but to specifically capture or kill oil ministers from the moderate countries to send a bloody, unambiguous message: fall in line or face the consequences. Now here is where state sponsorship allegedly enters the stage. Many historians believe that Carlos and his team weren't just idealists, but that they were likely backed or even commissioned by a state sponsor: Muammar al-Gaddafi's Libya. The PFLP-GC, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, was a hardline splinter group of, and should never be confused with, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist-Leninist Palestinian national liberation group. They broke away because they felt the original PFLP spent too much time reading theory and did not take enough action. Their goal for the siege was to whip up public sympathy across the Arab world, pressuring governments to pour more support into Palestine. Anis al-Nakach from the Social Democratic Fatah shared a similar goal. And then there were the Germans, Hans Joachim Klein, an autonomous radical, and Gabriele Kröcher-Tiedemann, an anarchist so dangerous her own group had to kidnap a politician just to bust her out of jail. The man calling the shots was a figure straight out of a spy movie, a Venezuelan operative named Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, better known as Carlos the Jackal. For 5 years, he had been a top gun for the PFLP, leaving a trail of bombings and shootings across London and Paris. Vienna was his newest assignment.
So we're back at the former OPEC building. The 6 terrorists have just stepped off the tram, the same commute we took to get here. Only theirs was a little different than ours. Heavily armed and on a mission to violate every international law in the book. They approach the main entrance and they walk right in, unchallenged.
There was a policeman on duty, but with no orders to search anyone or ask too many questions, so he simply watched them pass. The first, and perhaps most critical line of defense had just evaporated without a sound. The terrorists breached the inner offices, where 2 more policemen were stationed. But these officers were completely unarmed. Their sole instruction was to call for backup if any trouble should arise. Only there was no way for them to call backup. They had no phone and no radio to make any call. As the gunmen leveled their weapons at the terrified staff, one officer, Anton Tichler, who was soon to retire, tried to slip away to the elevators to get help. One of the gang, allegedly Tiedemann, called out to him, "Are you a cop?" Tichler, without stopping or turning, answered yes, and was executed with a shot to the back of his head. Almost simultaneously, an Iraqi minister's bodyguard was shot point blank in the face. Tiedemann is said to have fired both shots, but was never charged for it. The terrorists then fanned out, storming through the office rooms to round up hostages. In one chaotic moment, a man from the Libyan delegation made a grab for Carlos' machine gun slung over his shoulder and was promptly killed as well.
5 minutes later, help finally arrived. Sort of. 7 officers of the Vienna Police Department surrounded the office building.
Officer Leopolda and 2 colleagues began climbing the stairs as the elevator was out of service now. On the first floor, they were spotted by Klein. A wild shootout followed. Klein got shot in the guts, while Leopolda took a bullet to the buttocks. With their colleague wounded and facing heavy fire, the other 2 officers now retreated back down the stairs. In the wake of this botched police assault, a deal was struck. The terrorists, needing medical help for Klein, offered the police a temporary ceasefire to also allow the wounded officer Leopolda to be evacuated. About 90 minutes into the siege, they opened a humanitarian corridor for the ambulance. Both casualties were transported to the same hospital. When the dust had settled, the terrorists had a total of 62 hostages. The captives weren't just staff, but included 11 high-ranking government ministers from across the OPEC nations. All were herded into the building's main conference room, a space much like this one, and forced to split into groups by nationality. Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Emirates, and Qatar were designated as the group of hostile states, nations at odds with Libya's agenda. The Austrian authorities were in a state of shock. They were catastrophically ill-equipped for an attack of this scale in the heart of Vienna. While there had been a hostage situation years prior, this was different. These were international diplomats. This was now a global crisis. The police had no contingency plans. A severe shortage of bulletproof vests. After all, this never happens, and it was a Sunday, meaning almost no one on duty. To make matters worse, this was 1975. No cell phones, no internet. So how do you summon the national police forces? The government put out a desperate call via the only medium guaranteed to reach every Austrian police officer on a Sunday morning, by interrupting a national football broadcast with the urgent call ordering every available officer in the country to report to the capital immediately. Negotiations were slow at first. The terrorists demanded to speak through only one person, the Libyan ambassador to Austria, Mr. Al-Gadamzi. The only problem was that the ambassador was completely out of the loop. He had not been briefed and was completely unaware miles away in Prague. a member of the Iraqi embassy offered himself as intermediary instead. Their demands? First, a political manifesto had to be read on the Austrian public broadcast channels every 2 hours. Any failure to comply would cause one hostage to be executed every 15 minutes. They had a lot of them after all. Second, by 7 a.m. the next day, they were to be transported by bus to Vienna airport. There, a fully fueled jet would be waiting to fly them, along with their wounded comrade and all their hostages, to a destination of their choosing. Hearing their demands, the Austrian government scrambled into an emergency session. But there was a delay. Chancellor Bruno Kreisky was on vacation in Western Austria, and this was before COVID, so Zoom meetings weren't a thing back then. Kreisky had presided over a hostage crisis before, when PFLP members took hostages in Lower Austria years back. He had promptly agreed to all their terms to get them to release the hostages. True to form, minutes after entering the room, Kreisky made his decision: comply. The state radio broadcast was soon interrupted by a message from the Jackal and his associates, read by an Austrian news anchor for 20 minutes, every 2 hours. Their message was in French. They demanded that no Muslim state should ever recognize Israel. All Arab oil must be nationalized, and the OPEC countries should fund the Palestinian resistance. The message ended rather politely by apologizing for troubling the peace-loving Austrian people. In return for reading this message live on air, Kreisky demanded 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, every single hostage must board the plane voluntarily. Second, all Austrian citizens and permanent residents must be released before takeoff. Kreisky would later defend these actions with his trademark pragmatism. His primary duty as Austrian Chancellor was to protect Austrian lives, not to fight a geopolitical conflict on his own soil. The faster they were gone, the sooner they were someone else's problem.
As unthinkable as it might seem, the plan proceeded without any hiccup. The Austrian government provided a bus directly to the terrorists' doorstep. Right before boarding, the militants honored the deal and released all Austrian hostages. The remaining 33 captives, basically the entire OPEC leadership, were then loaded onto a bus and driven under police escort to Vienna International Airport.
Waiting on the tarmac was the final piece of the puzzle: an ambulance delivering the critically wounded Hans-Joachim Klein, accompanied by a doctor who had volunteered to stay with him for the duration of the coming flight. They were not going to leave him behind. The delegation was met by Austrian Interior Minister Otto Rösch. In a gesture of reassurance, Rösch shook the hand of every single hostage before they boarded the plane. At last, shortly before 9 a.m., with the cameras rolling, he shook the Jackal's hand, accidentally, as he would later state. The ringleader gave him a parting remark. "Send my regards to Mr. Kreisky," he said. "He acted wisely.